Alrighty. Well, let me turn down the volume a bit here. There we go. I got some songs recorded on my tablet, some saved on there, I guess downloaded or whatever. Anyway, stuff from when I was young. Like this song here was out when I was like 18 years old. Yeah, Caught Up in the Rapture by Anita Baker. Anyway, there's Rocky. I don't know if you can see him, but there he is if you can see him, asleep. I was just eating my discount salad, which is actually quite good. Yeah, Rocky's having a sleep there. I'm listening to Anita Baker on my tablet. Anyway, um, yeah, I'm going to tell you a story now that goes back to the early 1990s. I was in my early 20s in the early 1990s, and I had gotten quite sick. I mentioned this before. It was a combination of things, really. It was, um, as you may know from other videos I've done, I was used as a guinea pig for medical experiments when I was 8 years old in a hospital in Toronto, and that buggered me up in a lot of ways. And they kept me on a medication called ORAP, or Pimozide is another name for it. An awful medication. They said that I didn't have Tourette syndrome, that their testing showed I didn't have Tourette syndrome, but they were going to treat me as if I did have it. And so they put me on this drug called Pimozide, or ORAP is another name for it. It was made by McNeil Pharmaceutical Corporation. It's a drug that's really hard on your heart. They had me on massive doses of it. It turns out it's not to be used in the pediatric age group at all, and it's really a drug of last resort if you're dealing with a psychotic person. It isn't even really a good drug for Tourette syndrome if you have Tourette syndrome, which they said I didn't, but they were still going to treat me for it. Don't ask me to explain it. I say it's one of the reasons I don't trust doctors, is because of all that. Anyway, I was there when my parents were told this. And the doctor, this Rudolf Moldovsky, his name was, he was a world famous neurologist in those days. Very well known, very highly respected neurologist. He was the one that said he doesn't have Tourette syndrome, but we're going to treat him as if he does. And they put me on this drug. And he said, it'll do the equivalent of damage to him. And I was sitting there when this was said, of it's basically it'll do the equivalent damage of drinking 2 40 ounces of vodka a day. That's what it'll do to his body, and he'll probably die in his early 40s. But he said without it he'll have no quality of life, so they're going to put him on it. Yeah, anyway. Even as an 8-year-old, I remember sitting there thinking this is bullshit. But anyway, you had to do what you were told to do, though. Anyway, I took this drug until I was in my early 20s, and then I rebelled and refused to take it anymore. Because I was just sick all the time and weak, and it made me it just totally buggered me up. So I went to my family doctor, Dr. Tweedy, in Perth, Dr. James Tweedy, and he was a huge drug pusher. And he wouldn't hear of it. He basically said, no, you don't go off it. I wanted him to help me to get off it, and he refused. He said, no, you don't go off it. So I basically went cold turkey. I just quit taking it. And at the time, I was driving a taxi cab, which was you wouldn't think it would be, but it was a very high-stress job. And, and long hours, too. And sleeping and getting a few hours of sleep on the back seat of the car. After I'd taken the last of the drunks home from the bars, but before I had to start picking people up early in the morning to go to work. So, yeah, I was not in great shape anyway. And that's how it goes. So, that's the background anyway. I got really run down. I was coming down off these drugs that I had been on since 1976, and this was 1990. I was doing a very high stress job, working long hours, and dealing with all kinds of crap, basically. And so it was hard on the body. It was really hard on the body. And in those days, we didn't have cell phones like people do now. So we used to have to, oh, you have to pardon me here. Hold on a minute here. Sorry about this. All right. Pardon me. I'm really sorry about that. I had a piece of salad stuck in my teeth over here that are aching. That toothache's coming back in a big way. Anyway, thing was, the thing was anyway that I had I'd become really run down, and I forget what I was saying there before all the thing with my tooth was happening. But anyway, I'd become really run down. My doctor would not help me get off the drugs. I ended up getting the pneumonia, and my doctor refused to treat me. He said that it was all in my head, that I only thought that I had the pneumonia, and that I needed to go back on those drugs because I wasn't right in my head, and I thought I had the pneumonia when I didn't. But if I went back on the drugs, then I wouldn't think I had the pneumonia anymore. And he basically said if I refused to go back on the drugs, he's going to let me die. That as far as he was concerned, I could die. He didn't care if I wasn't going to do what he wanted me to do. So that's where I was at anyway. Like I say, that's one of the big reasons I'm afraid of hospitals, and I don't like to deal with medical people and so on like that. But bottom line is I was really run down. I got really sick. I ended up in the hospital a couple of times, which was a horror show. They actually tried to commit me to the Royal Ottawa Hospital, which is a mental institution in Ottawa. I was fighting for my life, and I was also having to fight the system. I had a lot of people turn against me at that time because they said, well, why won't he just do as the doctor says? Because that's the Canadian thing, do what the authorities tell you to do, never rebel. Anyway, the bottom line is, I finally got a doctor. I had to fire my doctor, basically, and I finally got another doctor, a doctor by the name of Gordon Jackson. He was a really good doctor, very compassionate man. He was a Christian man, too. And he was really good, anyway, and he took me seriously. And he actually did the necessary x-rays and tests and everything to find out what was going on with me. And I did have the pneumonia. In fact, I was nearly dead. My lungs are now permanently damaged. That's why I have that cough and why I wheeze and have trouble breathing. You may notice when I walk around in the field, oftentimes I'm gasping for breath and stuff. That's the reason for that, because my lungs are permanently damaged from all of that. Anyway, the thing is, he did x-rays and stuff, and he found out. So then I had to go on some real heavy-duty antibiotics to get the pneumonia out of my system. And I went through a battery of tests at that time. One of the tests that I had to go through was I had to have what do they call that? Ultrasound. Had to have an ultrasound done. And that was going to happen in the hospital in Smiths Falls. I was living in Perth at the time. Smiths Falls is 12 miles away. That was going to happen at the hospital in Smiths Falls. Anyway, I had to show up early in the morning. It was like around 8 o'clock in the morning. I had to be there for this ultrasound. And it was down in the basement of the hospital. That's where all the x-ray stuff and ultrasound and all that particular part of the hospital business was in the basement. So when I got there, I had to take the elevator down to the basement. And anyway, when I got down there, I had to go down a long corridor to where the ultrasound room was to meet with the ultrasound technician and have this test. Now, I'm going to tell you a little background now because this story it's an interesting story and I think you'll find it interesting. You may not believe me, or you might turn around and say all those doctors that thought you were crazy were right, obviously, if this is what you're saying happened. But it did happen, and just as sure as I'm sitting here now, it did happen. And here's the story, and here's a little background for you. My old friend Tom Kerr, who I speak of sometimes, who's actually a cousin of mine, a distant cousin, he had several children. He and his wife Helen did. The oldest child was Raymond, a boy by the name of Raymond. Raymond took his own life by shooting himself to death in 1986, I believe it was. There was another son, Kevin. There was a daughter, Roseanne. There was a daughter, Sharon, and there was a daughter, Allison. And Sharon's the girl that I'm going to speak about now. Sharon had juvenile diabetes, which, if you know anything about juvenile diabetes, you'll know it's a wicked, awful thing. It's just a real curse, it is, you know. And that's what she had. She had juvenile diabetes. And Sharon and I were actually pretty good friends. I worked with Sharon. When I was working at the Perth Museum, I actually worked with Sharon. And of course, I knew Sharon from my association with her father and like that. You know, I knew the whole family. And Sharon was really a really wonderful person anyway. Just a very, very kind-hearted, very, just a genuinely good person. But Sharon had a lot of things happen, you know, in her life and stuff. Life hadn't been kind to Sharon. Now, Sharon was only in her early 30s at the time that this happened, this story I'm going to tell. Like I say, and her juvenile diabetes plays into this, so that's why I'm bringing it up, because that's part of the story. Anyway, I'm walking down this hallway in around 1991, I guess it was. Like I say, I was only in my early 20s at the time. I turned 20 in 1988, so what, 89, 90, 91, so I was about 23, somewhere in there, I guess, 23, 24 years old. Anyway, I'm walking down the hallway, and there's an x-ray room there, and you see on the door it says x-ray, and there's a wheelchair sitting there beside the x-ray room. And in the wheelchair sat Sharon Kerr. She was sitting there wearing a blue hospital gown, you know, one of those blue things that ties up in the back. She was sitting there wearing a blue hospital gown, and she had her right elbow on the armrest of the chair, and she was resting her head on her hand. And when I walked past, she looked up at me. Our eyes met, and there was recognition. She knew who I was, and I knew who she was. But for some reason, I felt like I shouldn't speak, and I didn't. Well, I get into the ultrasound room, and I'm having this ultrasound test done on me. And I'm laying there and thinking, well, why wouldn't I speak? I mean, I know her. She's a friend of mine. Why wouldn't I at least say hello? And I thought, well, when I get out of here, if she's still sitting there, I'm going to speak to her. Like, why wouldn't I? You know, I don't know why I didn't speak the first time. That was strange that I didn't speak to her when I went past her the first time. Anyway, so I resolved that I was going to speak to her if I saw her in the wheelchair on my way out, if she was still sitting there. I remember wondering, because she lived in Perth, and I wondered why she was in Smiths Falls. And I thought, well, and she was outside the x-ray department. I thought, well, maybe she got into a car accident close to here, and they're just checking her out to make sure she's okay or something. Going to do an x-ray her in case maybe she's complaining about pain or something. Who knows? Like, I thought it had to be something like that. Because otherwise, why would she be here? Anyway, because they have an x-ray department in Perth. They didn't have the ultrasound in Perth at that time, but they did have the x-ray department there. So again, I couldn't, and they had an emergency ward and all that, so in Perth, so I couldn't figure it out, but I knew it was her. And I thought, well, it must be something like that she's been in some kind of an accident, and they're just nearby, and they're just checking her out to make sure she's okay or something. Anyway, I leave the hospital. I leave the hospital after this test. When I came out of the ultrasound room, the wheelchair was still there, but it was empty. And I thought, well, they've probably taken her into the x-ray room, to do whatever they're doing with her. Anyway, I went ahead home. Didn't think any more of it. Later that day, I found out that she had passed away. And she had passed away in that hospital, and it was due to complications from her diabetes. And she had already been dead for hours. When I saw her sitting in that wheelchair, she was already gone. Like she had passed away hours before that. Like she had passed away at like 4 in the morning or something, and I was there at 8 in the morning. She's already gone for like 4 hours. And yet I saw her sitting there perfectly alive and well in that wheelchair at 8 o'clock in the morning. So there you go. Anyway, there's a story, Anyway, things like that happen. I'm not going to claim to understand it. I'm not going to claim to be able to explain it. I'm only relaying what happened, what I experienced, And like I say, she was sitting there and she looked just as solid as anybody. She wasn't transparent or anything, I mean, she looked just as solid as anybody. Now, if I had tried to touch her, I don't know what would have happened. If I had reached out and tried to put my hand on her or something, I really don't know what would have happened. And if I had spoke to her, I don't know what would have happened. But I kind of knew not to speak to her for some reason, and I can't tell you why. I don't know. But it was just, for some reason, I was inhibited from speaking to her. And it did strike me funny after the fact, and that's why I resolved that I would speak to her if she was still sitting there when I came out. It turns out the reason she was in Smiths Falls is because that's where her diabetes doctor was. She had been sent to Smiths Falls because when she took a bad turn, because that's where her diabetes doctor was. He was in Smiths Falls. So that explains why she was in the hospital in Smiths Falls. But anyway, she was already gone when I saw her. And like I say, I didn't see a corpse sitting in a wheelchair or anything. She was alive when I saw her, even though she wasn't, Anyway, that's just a story of something that I experienced. I've had a lot of strange experiences like that over the years. And, unfortunately, my doctor, Gordon Jackson, he developed a brain tumor, and he passed away. He was still quite young when he passed away. And then, like I say, I very seldom had any really good doctors. Most of the doctors I've dealt with have been horrible. But anyway, I can honestly say he was a good doctor, and I miss him because he was a good doctor, and I trusted him. And one thing I do find with doctors, if a doctor is a Christian, and you can say what you like about Christians, and people these days don't like Christians and all the rest of it, but the only doctors I've ever had that were any good at all were Christians. The only doctors I ever had who actually cared were Christians. That's just been my experience, is all. Make of that what you will too, but The other doctors I've had have only wanted to, I don't know, just to impose things on me that weren't good for me, and stuff. And, you know, even when I busted my arm in 4 places, I was an orthopedic surgeon by the name of Dr. Anderson that put my arm back together. He had to operate on me and put a plate in it. And he was really good. He was really caring. He was really compassionate. And he did a really good job putting my arm back together. Like, he just did an amazing job. And when I had my visit with him after the fact, when I had to go up and we looked at the x-rays and stuff, and when I had my final meeting with him, he put the x-ray up into the, that lighted screen that they have. And he says, "Oh," he said, "it's healing beautifully." He said, "It's healing beautifully. Praise God," he said, "for that. Praise the Lord for that." He said, "It's healing beautifully." And so right there, see, that was a Christian man. That was a Christian doctor. And like I say, and he definitely cared. I mean, you could tell that was a man who truly cared about the people he operated on. So anyway, that's it. And actually, he's in demand. He wants to retire because he's getting old and he wants to retire. He may have retired by now. I don't know. The last I heard, he was wanting to retire, but he couldn't because there was a shortage of orthopedic surgeons around here and he was needed. But he really did want to retire. He was ready to pack it in, but he kept at it because he was needed so badly around here. Anyway, that's it. We'll talk to you later.